Welcome to the Medieval Content channel. This is a video essay regarding the use of professional wrestling within historical reenactment. It might be strange for someone to have grown up in at least America, but perhaps the world over, and not have had even 1 minute's exposure to the wild and wacky circus known as professional wrestling. Billed as a sport, but it's everything but. Labeled a competition, and if you look past the oddly placed chairs and kendo sticks under the mat, you'll realize the only competition involved is with the boys in the back, and everything laid out before you is just a carefully or sloppily contrived dance. From the mega powers of the racist white supremacist Hulk Hogan and the actually talented Macho Man Randy Savage, to the technical within the spectacle of the 90s with the works of Bret the Hitman Hart and Shawn Michaels, smile or otherwise. Finally, to the pulseless, muted, and padded down work of the 2000s on, professional wrestling has inspired far too many people to do exactly what they claim you shouldn't do, which is to try this at home. It doesn't matter who says what, or what thoughts they had, from Jim Cornette in the Territory days to the sloppy, injury-prone trampoline cowboy days of today has awkwardly crippled itself into. We will imitate what we love, or are fascinated by, or just find interesting. Sometimes that fascination can bleed into other equally appropriate mediums, such as historical reenactment, and more specifically, for me, medieval reenactment, as that is my area of expertise. However, is professional wrestling something that reenactors should be trying to emulate and integrate into stage combat? The first thing you need to ask yourself as a reenactor is, what exactly does your group have to say about this? It's a little strange to go around and see certain factions within our industry try to claim to perform historically accurate fighting when we all know it's not, and is far closer to Luke Skywalker battling Darth Vader, or the excellence of execution going toe-to-toe with the Heartbreak Kid, than actual historical combat. But there is a difference, and I think a question does need to be answered if you want to consider mixing the two, though similar, separate mediums. My personal opinions of professional wrestling from the Territory days of the Midnight Express, Jerry Lawler, the Jarretts, to the distortion of reality known as the WWE, and the Cirque du Soleil of injuries, cults, that is, AEW, set aside, I wanted to think solely on the application of professional wrestling into historical reenactment, starting from my very first year of stage combat, doing an alleged historically accurate medieval festival. Alleged because we did a postmodern version of King Arthur, and poorly so at that, instead of the 5th century Saxon killing warlord, the Welsh Arthur, which would have been far more closer to history. However, that's just me being cheeky, me being a little catty, and beside the point. But it was a fantasy scenario, and probably the perfect point to include in an interpretation of wrestling into reenactment. Every year, we cycle through a list of stage combat techniques that, over time, grew to include a few extra, perhaps historically adequate techniques that we interpret safely, despite, of course, there being no true historically accurate combat from the medieval period in historical reenactment. I will reiterate that as often as possible, because if you think what you do is what they did, it is not. Let's underscore that historical reenactment is as close to professional wrestling without playing Cult of Personality, or having the fireworks when you flex in the middle of your chessboard or tournament or SCA battle. Digression is a thing with me. I'm long-winded, but let's cycle back to the beginning of this diatribe regarding that list of maneuvers we learn at the beginning of each year. We will start with the 1 through 8s of sword combat, though there are much more to learn out there than just that. But that's just a simple cinematic stage combat techniques. From there, including a slap, punch, naps, which I vehemently disagree with, holds, tosses, rolls, cover, so on and so forth. but inevitably someone in the group will integrate a wrestling move within this combat schematic. Once it is a drop kick, or one time it was something more reasonable like a choke slam or a big boot, headlock, takedown, hip toss, or heck, someone has even tried to do what is called a Hurricane Rana one year. My thoughts each time I see this was always to look at it with eyes rolled and disgust in my heart, thinking wrestling doesn't belong in what we do. We are stage combat actors, not impetuous Mark Bookers like that impotent Tony Khan with his toy figures of trampling cowboys, or Vince McMahon and his fetishized giant white supremacist muscle builders. We were Bret Hart. We are Shawn Michaels. We were Luke Skywalker. And later on, the only well-written character in his series, Kylo Ren. As to say, we were reserved, conservative in our fantasy elements of showmanship, and appealed more to techniques than selling people a sizzling steak that didn't exist. The more I'd see this, which was only centered around about 2 or 3 people in our group that seemed to like professional wrestling, the more I began to think of how it could be interpreted in what we do more covertly, or correctly, or perhaps historically. And strangely, the crowd tends to pop when we do implement it. So, as long as it was just one person doing it once and not heavily referenced throughout the show, wrestlers themselves have seen what we do, my specific group actually, and commented on how crazy we were, or use real medieval weapons, brother, despite the fact that it is carefully choreographed for months before we even let another living person outside our field see this. Sometimes a wrestler just wings it in the ring, and if it's with someone that lacks any talent whatsoever, it becomes an AEW match. Things took me back to the idea of this should even be interpreted within reenactment. Is there a place for it, even if it's just sparsely peppered in? Wrestling certainly was a thing, but professional wrestling is the furthest thing from actual hand-to-hand combat that would have been performed in the Olympics. How strict and how reeled in are we going to be here? We all think we're the best in the world at what we do. We all think we're doing it the right way. And in reality, we're all just learning and figuring things out like everybody else in the entertainment industry. Ultimately, I've fallen on the side of not allowing professional wrestling within medieval stage combat interpretations, save for anything that already falls into the list of maneuvers we perform that makes sense, instead of trying to draw similarities with personalities and the dedication of some of the great wrestlers in history have put into their craft. Whatever your opinion is on the combat aspect of professional wrestling versus sword combat, or the interpretation of medieval/Renaissance combat, is up to you and your group. However, we shouldn't, no matter what is chosen, deny the absolute gravity of personalities like Jim Cornette and the Midnight Express, and how they would have held the crowd in the palms of their hands by doing the bare basics of wrestling combat psychology. Bret Hart, and how he'd put his heart and soul into doing the best at what he did, because otherwise, why are you doing it? Or Shawn Michaels, who put everything into his performance art as well as the technical aspect, if sometimes certainly going a little too far in the performance department when things didn't go his way. Which reminds me of a couple people in my group. And you know who you are. Something can be said of the art of professional wrestling behind the scenes, the psychology of wrestlers in the ring, working the crowds, as well as themselves. This isn't me advocating elaborate 20-minute entrances, fireworks, costumes, and musical promos. No, this is me advocating watching someone like Bret Hart work his match and how he seems to be so damn good at accentuating and raising every person he works with because he learns his craft, and thinking maybe you, a reenactor, could learn from this by putting your heart and soul into what your director is trying to teach you and help others learn as well as you have by putting them over in fights and caring about the show more than yourself. This is advocating for the prowess of individuals like Jim Cornette, who can still work the world over with just the simplest hot takes. However, back in the day, him and the Midnight Express were the masters of their craft as the bad guys of every territory, to the point that even elderly grandmothers wanted to knife them in the parking lot. Learn from the psychology of the best and figure out how to use improv and psychology to convey the depth of your character out in the reenactment lanes as well as on the board or your battlefield by playing up who you are, your intentions, and feeding off the crowd's reaction, which, by the way, you should absolutely be trying to garner as a performer. Otherwise, why are you here? So, learn from Shawn Michaels the perfection of his persona and how, despite his demon, egomaniacal nature akin to the Omegas of today, he was still able to conquer the industry with just his voice and backed it up with his skill in the ring. A lot of people in reenactment have problems from anxiety, egos, sociopathy, abusive backgrounds, or some sort of quirk that we find ways to conquer or, sadly, accent through historical reenactment. Perhaps the journey of someone who did what they could to battle those demons and come back and give back to the industry he loved is what you should take from professional wrestling and apply it to historical reenactment. We're all human. We're all performers of some sort. What do you take from professional wrestling if you're a historical reenactor? Is it okay to use the sharpshooter in the middle of a sword fight? Or do you think the nuance of an industry eerily similar to ours is the better approach? Love it, hate it. Professional wrestling is here to stay, unless that fragile daddy spend bucks crumble cake Tony Khan kills off every wrestler with his mark booking and hands-off approach to understanding anything about the industry. Hot takes and hot cakes aside, I'm interested in other reenactors' opinions on the concept of this video essay itself, as I do personally know some who do both reenactment as well as wrestling. So if you're not down with that, I got 2 words for you. Like and subscribe. But otherwise, that has been that for this video essay. It is merely an opinion piece. I am neither right nor wrong. That is up to you to decide for yourself. May David Bowie's gift of music light your way.